Room 217. Whatever you do, don't ask for room 217. But if you're brave enough to stay there, you might want to keep the lights on. Because what happened in that room in 1911 didn't just change the hotel forever. It might have opened a doorway that was never supposed to be opened. I'm about to take you inside the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, a place so terrifying that it inspired one of the most horrific novels ever written. And trust me, the true stories from this place, they're far more disturbing than any fiction. Over the next half hour, I'm going to share with you documented encounters, witness testimonies, and incidents that have been reported by hundreds of guests and staff members over more than a century. These aren't urban legends. These are real experiences from real people who walked into this hotel as skeptics and left as believers. By the end of this video, you'll understand why paranormal investigators consider the Stanley Hotel one of the most actively haunted locations in the entire world, and why some people who stayed there refuse to ever go back. But before we dive into the terrifying encounters, we need to understand how this all began. Because the story of the Stanley Hotel starts with a dying man who refused to accept his fate. Freeland Oscar Stanley sat in a doctor's office in Boston receiving a death sentence, tuberculosis, the White Plague. In that era, it was essentially incurable, and his case was advanced. The doctor gave him months, maybe a year if he was lucky. Stanley was only 53 years old. But Stanley wasn't just anyone. He and his twin brother Francis had invented the Stanley Steamer automobile, one of the most successful cars of the early 1900s. They were millionaires, innovators, men who solved problems. And F.O. Stanley refused to simply lie down and die. He'd heard stories about the mountain air out west curing respiratory diseases, desperate people traveling to Colorado and coming back healthy. It sounded like fantasy, but what did he have to lose? So Stanley and his wife Flora packed their things and made the long journey to Estes Park, Colorado, a tiny settlement in the Rocky Mountains, 7,500 feet above sea level. The air was thin, cold, and so pure it almost hurt to breathe. And then something miraculous happened. Within weeks, Stanley's condition began improving. The coughing fits lessened. He could breathe deeply again. After 6 months, he returned to his doctor in Boston, who examined him and found nothing. The tuberculosis was gone, completely. The doctor had no medical explanation. Stanley believed the mountain air had saved his life, and in his gratitude and with his businessman's eye for opportunity, he decided to build a grand resort hotel so that other wealthy people could experience the same healing power of the Colorado mountains. But as construction began in 1907, local workers started reporting something strange. They said the land felt wrong, that sometimes, late in the day when the shadows grew long, they'd see figures watching them from the tree line, figures that would vanish when you looked directly at them. The native Arapaho and Ute peoples had long considered these particular mountains spiritually significant. Some areas were sacred. There were stories about certain places where the spirits grew restless, where the veil between worlds grew thin. Stanley dismissed these stories as superstition. He was a man of science, of progress. He pushed forward with construction. The Stanley Hotel opened its doors on July 4, 1909. 400 feet long, gleaming white Georgian colonial architecture with 140 rooms and every modern luxury. It was magnificent. But within the first month of operation, the staff started whispering about something being off. And then came 1911, the year everything changed forever. Elizabeth Wilson had worked at the Stanley Hotel since it opened. She was the head housekeeper, meticulous, professional, trusted completely by the Stanley family. She'd lit the acetylene lamps in guest rooms hundreds of times. It was routine, safe, or so everyone thought. June 25, 1911. A massive storm rolled into Estes Park that evening, the kind of violent mountain storm where lightning strikes so close you can feel the electricity in the air. The hotel's electrical system was unreliable, so during storms, staff relied on acetylene gas lamps for lighting. Elizabeth entered room 217 carrying her lamplighter. She was alone. The room was on the second floor overlooking the mountains, one of the hotel's finest accommodations. What no one knew was that there was a leak in the gas line feeding the room's lamp. Acetylene had been slowly filling the space for hours. The room was a bomb waiting for a spark. The explosion was heard throughout the entire hotel. Witnesses said it sounded like thunder had struck the building itself. The blast blew out the windows of room 217 and the rooms on either side. Flames shot into the hallway, and Elizabeth Wilson was thrown through the air with such force that she crashed through the floor, falling into the McGregor Room dining area directly below. Guests and staff rushed to the scene, expecting to find her dead. Miraculously, she was alive, badly injured with broken bones and severe burns, but conscious. They said she kept apologizing, worried she'd be fired for the accident. F.O. Stanley himself rode with her to the hospital. He paid for all her medical treatment, which lasted months, and promised her that she'd have a job at his hotel for the rest of her life. Elizabeth eventually recovered and did return to work, continuing as head housekeeper for decades. But room 217 was never quite the same after that explosion. The hotel was repaired, the room rebuilt, but staff began reporting odd occurrences almost immediately. Maids would prepare the room perfectly, bed made with hospital corners, fresh towels folded just so, everything in its place. They'd lock the door and move on to the next room. But when they'd return an hour later to do a final check, they'd find things moved. A towel unfolded and refolded differently. The bedspread smoothed in a way that wasn't quite how they'd left it. Small adjustments, perfectionist touches. It was Elizabeth's style exactly. She'd always been particular about how things should be done. As the years passed and Elizabeth eventually died, the activity in room 217 didn't stop, it intensified. Guests began reporting bizarre experiences. They'd check into the room, unpack their suitcases, and go out to dinner or hiking. When they returned, they'd find their belongings had been unpacked again, but differently. Clothes refolded, items rearranged, everything organized with a precision that suggested someone who really cared about proper housekeeping. At first, guests would complain to the front desk, thinking a maid had gone through their things, but the hotel would check their records and confirm that no staff had entered the room. The electronic key logs showed only the guest's access. One couple in the 1990s reported that they woke up in the middle of the night to see a woman standing at the foot of their bed, wearing an old-fashioned housekeeper's uniform. She was tidying their clothes, which they'd left draped over a chair. Their clothes were still warm to the touch, as if someone had just been handling them. But Elizabeth's presence, while startling, is considered one of the gentler spirits at the Stanley Hotel. She seems to simply be continuing her life's work, caring for the room she loved. Guests who've experienced her say there's nothing malevolent about it, just deeply, deeply strange. Room 217 became famous for these hauntings. So famous that decades later, a struggling writer specifically asked to stay there, hoping the ghost stories might inspire him. That writer was Stephen King, and what happened to him in room 217 would terrify millions of people around the world. But we'll get to that, because first, we need to talk about Flora Stanley and the music that never stops. If you walk through the Stanley Hotel late at night, after the tours have ended and most guests are asleep, you might hear something beautiful drifting through the halls. Piano music, complex, classical pieces performed with obvious skill. You follow the sound to the ballroom, peer through the windows, and see an empty room, a silent piano. But the music continues. Flora Stanley was as remarkable as her husband. While F.O. was the businessman and inventor, Flora was an accomplished concert pianist who trained at some of the finest music schools in America. She'd given up a potential professional career to marry F.O., but she never stopped playing. When the Stanley Hotel was built, F.O. made sure the ballroom featured a magnificent Steinway grand piano, positioned perfectly for acoustics. Flora would give concerts there regularly for guests, for locals, for visiting dignitaries. The ballroom would fill with music that echoed through the entire building. Flora and F.O. spent every summer at their hotel, greeting guests, hosting parties, making sure everything was perfect. They poured their hearts into the place. It wasn't just a business investment, it was their legacy, their gift to the world that had healed F.O.'s dying body. F.O. had died a year earlier in 1940. Wait, let me correct that. F.O. actually outlived Flora. He died in 1940 and she had passed in 1939. The hotel passed to new owners, and over the decades it changed hands several times, falling into various states of disrepair and restoration. But something strange started happening in the ballroom. The night staff, making their rounds after the hotel closed for the evening, would hear piano music. Full concerts, performed with professional skill. They'd rush to the ballroom, certain someone had broken in or a guest was playing after hours. The ballroom would be dark, empty, locked, the piano untouched, the bench perfectly positioned. But as they stood there in the darkness, they could still hear the faint echo of music fading away. This has been happening for over 80 years. Security guards, housekeeping staff, maintenance workers, managers, dozens of employees have experienced it, and it's always the same pattern. The music starts late at night, usually after midnight. It's always classical pieces, the kind Flora loved to play. It lasts anywhere from a few minutes to half an hour. And the moment someone enters the ballroom, it stops. But here's what makes it truly eerie. Guests staying in rooms near the ballroom have recorded the phenomenon. There are dozens of videos online, people filming their phones toward the closed ballroom doors, while piano music clearly plays in the background. You can hear it distinctly, complex melodies, proper timing, professional technique. Then someone walks up and opens the doors, and the recording shows the music cutting off instantly, the empty ballroom, the silent piano. Audio analysis of these recordings confirms that the music isn't coming from speakers or another source. It's acoustically behaving as if it's coming from inside that room, from that specific piano. Some guests have reported seeing her. A woman in an early 1900s-style dress, sitting at the piano, playing with her eyes closed. She appears solid, real, three-dimensional. People have walked into the ballroom and assumed she was a historical reenactor or employee in costume. And then she fades, becomes translucent, disappears. One guest in 2003 described approaching Flora, though he didn't know who she was at the time, to compliment her playing. He said she turned to look at him, smiled sadly, and said something he couldn't quite hear. Then she vanished. He could still feel the warmth in the air where she'd been sitting. When he described the woman to the front desk staff, they showed him a historical photograph of Flora Stanley. He went pale. That was her, exactly her. Flora's spirit seems content to simply play music for eternity in the ballroom she loved. But not all the presences at the Stanley Hotel are so peaceful, because up on the 4th floor, where the children play, something much darker lingers. The 4th floor of the Stanley Hotel was designed differently from the luxurious guest rooms below. It was the servants' quarters, small rooms, narrow hallways, lower ceilings. And at the end of the hallway was the playroom, where the children of wealthy guests would be sent with their nannies while the adults enjoyed the hotel's amenities. Out of the way. Quiet, maybe too quiet. Guests staying on the 3rd floor frequently complain about noise from above, the sound of children running back and forth in the hallway, footsteps pounding rapidly from one end to the other, giggling, the distinctive sound of a ball bouncing, that rubber ball impact sound, rhythmic and repetitive. This happens at all hours, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., over and over. Exhausted guests call the front desk to complain. Security is sent to investigate. They climb to the 4th floor, prepared to find some children whose parents aren't controlling them. The 4th floor is always empty, completely silent. Many of the rooms aren't even in use. They're being renovated or used for storage. There are no children, no guests at all. But here's where it gets deeply unsettling. Security will stand in that 4th floor hallway, radioing down that there's no one there. And while they're standing there, the 3rd floor guests are still hearing the sounds directly above their rooms. The timing doesn't match. The sounds are happening in real time, but there's no physical source. One security guard in 2008 described standing perfectly still in the 4th floor hallway, speaking into his radio, when he heard right next to him a child's giggle. So close it could have been a child standing beside him. He spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Nothing. He was alone. And then he heard it again from the other direction. Another giggle, playful, like a child playing hide and seek. He radioed for backup and refused to stay up there alone. There appear to be at least 2 child spirits, possibly more. Most commonly, people report seeing 2 young girls, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, wearing clothing from the early 1900s, sailor-style dresses that were popular for children then. They're often seen holding hands, standing at the end of the hallway, just watching. When approached, they vanish, sometimes fading away, sometimes simply disappearing between one blink and the next. But it's not just visual encounters. People report feeling small hands touching them on the 4th floor, tugging at their clothes. One woman said she felt a child's hand slip into hers while she was walking down the hallway. She looked down and saw nothing, but she could feel the distinct sensation of small fingers gripping hers. The sensation lasted for several seconds before releasing. Here's what the hotel historians have pieced together. In the early years of the Stanley Hotel's operation, children of wealthy guests were often cared for by nannies in that 4th floor playroom. The children would spend hours up there, largely unsupervised, while their parents socialized downstairs. There are no official records of children dying at the hotel, at least none that have been found. But in that era, childhood deaths were common and often went unrecorded, especially if the family wanted privacy. Illnesses could strike quickly at high altitude. Accidents could happen. Some paranormal investigators believe the children on the fourth floor don't know they're dead. They're still playing, still waiting for their parents to come collect them, trapped in a loop of innocent activities that has lasted over a century. Something that isn't a child. Multiple witnesses have reported encountering a tall, dark figure in the fourth floor hallways, always seen from behind, turning a corner or entering a room. It's described as a man's silhouette, wearing what looks like early 1900s formal attire. But when people follow to investigate, there's never anyone there. One paranormal investigator in 2015 captured something extraordinary on video. He was filming the empty fourth floor hallway with a night vision camera. On the recording, you can see what appears to be a tall, dark shadow move across the far end of the hall, distinctly humanoid, moving with purpose. The investigator calls out, asking if anyone is there. The shadow stops and appears to turn toward the camera. Then it moves toward him rapidly, getting larger in the frame. The investigator stumbles backward, you hear him gasp, and the video cuts off. He later described feeling an overwhelming sense of malevolence, of wrongness. He said, whatever that presence was, it didn't want him there. It wasn't a confused spirit or a residual haunting, it was aware, intelligent, and hostile. Because while the children might just be playing, whatever else is up there with them isn't playing at all. But of all the hauntings at the Stanley Hotel, the housekeeper, the pianist, the children, the shadow figure, none of them would become as famous as what happened in September 1974. The night that would change horror fiction forever and make this hotel's reputation permanent. September 1974. Stephen King was 27 years old and struggling. He'd published his first novel, Carrie, earlier that year, but he was still teaching English at a high school and living paycheck to paycheck. He and his wife Tabitha decided to take a short vacation to Colorado, hoping to recharge before the school year really got going. They'd heard about the Stanley Hotel, this grand old place in the mountains. They decided to spend one night there before the hotel closed for the winter season. That single night would terrify millions of people around the world. King has told this story many times in interviews, and the details have remained consistent. He and Tabitha arrived at the Stanley Hotel on September 30th, just before the hotel closed for the season. They were informed they'd be the only guests in the entire building that night. The rest of the rooms were empty, shut down, covered in dust sheets. The staff was minimal, just a few people to maintain the property and help the Kings if they needed anything. Otherwise, Stephen and Tabitha would have 140 rooms, endless corridors, and 4 floors to themselves. They checked into room 217. Yes, that room 217. The room where Elizabeth Wilson had nearly died in the explosion. The room where guests reported their suitcases being mysteriously unpacked. King didn't know any of this at the time. They had dinner in the hotel's massive dining room, just the two of them, with a single waiter serving them in a space designed for hundreds. King later described it as deeply surreal. Their voices echoed. The empty tables stretched away into shadows. He said he kept feeling like he was being watched, but whenever he'd turned to look, there was nothing there. After dinner, Tabitha went to bed early. King wasn't tired, so he decided to explore the hotel. He wandered the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. He rode the elevator up and down. He stood in the empty ballroom. He walked through corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. He said the hotel felt alive, not in a comforting way. In a way that made him feel like the building was aware of him, studying him. Eventually, he returned to room 217 and went to bed. This is where it gets chilling. King has described the nightmare in vivid detail. He dreamed he was in room 217, but it was different, darker, more malevolent. He heard his 3-year-old son Joe screaming from somewhere in the hotel. Screaming in absolute terror, the kind of scream a parent never wants to hear from their child. King ran into the hallway, searching frantically. The hotel's corridors stretched impossibly long, turning in ways that didn't make architectural sense. He could hear Joe screaming, but he couldn't find him. Every door he tried was locked. Every turn led to another endless hallway. He came upon a fire hose mounted on the wall, the kind in glass cases that hotels have for emergencies. As he ran past it, the hose began to move. It uncoiled itself like a snake, writhing and reaching for him. King ran, but the hose chased him, and he could feel it getting closer. Then he saw Joe at the end of a hallway, but there was something with him. something tall and dark that King couldn't quite see clearly. It had its hands on Joe's shoulders, and as King ran toward them, the thing looked up at him and smiled. King has said that smile, whatever it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen, even in a dream. He woke up gasping, his heart pounding. Tabitha woke too, alarmed, asking what was wrong. King told her about the nightmare, and they both lay there in the darkness of room 217, listening to the old hotel creak and settle around them. King couldn't go back to sleep. His writer's mind was racing. The dream had felt so real, so vivid, and so complete. It wasn't just random nightmare imagery, it was a story, a full narrative. He could see the entire structure of it in his mind. He got out of bed, found a pen and paper, and sat in the bathroom so the light wouldn't disturb Tabitha. And there, at 3 a.m. in room 217 of the Stanley Hotel, Stephen King outlined the entire novel that would become The Shining. By the time the sun rose and they checked out the next morning, King knew he had something special. He'd changed the hotel in his story, making it the Overlook Hotel in an even more isolated location. He'd changed some details, made it darker, more explicitly supernatural, but the core was all there. A family staying in a haunted hotel during the off-season. The father slowly being driven insane by the building's malevolent presence. The hotel itself being alive, hungry, wanting to consume them. The psychic child who could sense the danger. The ghosts in the rooms. The sense of being trapped was something evil. The Shining was published in 1977 and became King's first hardcover bestseller. It's now considered one of the greatest horror novels ever written. The 1980 film adaptation by Stanley Kubrick, while different from the book, is equally legendary, and all of it came from one nightmare in one room at the Stanley Hotel. Stephen King has said in multiple interviews that he doesn't believe the nightmare was just his imagination. He thinks the hotel gave it to him. He said he felt like the Stanley Hotel wanted its story told, and it chose him to tell it. After The Shining was published, the Stanley Hotel's reputation changed forever. It became synonymous with horror, with hauntings, with the supernatural, and according to the staff, the paranormal activity intensified dramatically. It was as if all the attention, all the fear, all the dark expectations fed whatever was living there, made it stronger. So what happened next? How did the Stanley Hotel respond to becoming America's most famous haunted hotel? And what new hauntings emerged in the decades after Stephen King's visit? Because the story is far from over. By the 1990s, the Stanley Hotel had fully embraced its haunted reputation. They began offering ghost tours, hosting paranormal investigation teams, and marketing specifically to people who wanted to experience something supernatural. Room 217 had a waiting list months long. But the staff started noticing something concerning. The hauntings weren't just continuing, they were evolving, becoming more frequent, more intense, more physical. In 1995, a housekeeper named Maria, the hotel has never released her last name, was cleaning a third-floor room when she heard a child crying. She followed the sound into the hallway and saw one of the little girls from the fourth floor standing near the stairwell, tears streaming down her face. Maria approached to help, asking what was wrong. The girl looked up at her and said, "Clear as day, I can't find my mama." Maria reached out to comfort her, and her hand passed through the child's shoulder. The girl vanished. Maria quit that day and never came back. He thought it was an earthquake until he realized his wife, asleep next to him, wasn't moving at all. Only his side of the bed was shaking. It lasted for about 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In 2001, a couple staying in room 401 directly above room 217 reported hearing a woman's voice calling for help. They called the front desk, who sent security. They searched every room on the fourth floor. No one was there. But the couple insisted they could still hear it, fainter now, like it was coming from inside the walls. In 2003, the entire electrical system on the second floor malfunctioned simultaneously during a ghost tour. Every light went out at once, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. The backup emergency lights didn't come on. For about 30 seconds, 20 tourists and 2 guides stood in absolute blackness, and several people reported feeling something move past them, brushing against them, breathing near their faces. When the lights came back on, one woman had scratches on her arm that hadn't been there before, 3 parallel lines like fingernails. Security footage from the hallway camera showed the lights going out, but the camera kept recording in infrared. You could see the tourists' panicked body heat signatures. And moving between them, there appeared to be other heat signatures, shapes that looked human, but moved in ways that weren't quite right. The hotel brought in professional paranormal investigation teams, some of the most respected in the field. They set up extensive equipment, infrared cameras, EMF detectors, audio recorders, motion sensors, the works. They ran multi-day investigations, scientifically documenting whatever they could find. The results were remarkable. They recorded unexplained voices speaking full sentences. They captured temperature drops of 20-30 degrees in localized areas with no natural explanation. They documented objects moving on camera with no one touching them. In one famous recording from 2007, an investigation team set up a voice recorder in the fourth-floor playroom and left the room, closing the door. They asked questions out loud before leaving. "Is anyone here with us? Can you tell us your name?" When they reviewed the recording, there were responses. A child's voice, clear enough to understand, saying, "We're still here, we're still playing." Then an adult voice, much deeper and more menacing, "They can't leave." The investigators immediately packed up and left. Several team members said they'd investigated hundreds of locations and never experienced anything that unsettling. A guest named Henry Yao was taking photos in the main stairwell, just casual tourist photos. When he reviewed them later, one photo showed what appeared to be a translucent figure descending the stairs. It looked like a woman in early 1900s dress, clearly visible but semi-transparent. Yao hadn't seen anything unusual when he took the photo. The staircase had appeared empty. But there it was, undeniable, in the image. He posted it online, and it was analyzed by dozens of experts. No evidence of photo manipulation was found. The figure appeared to be genuinely in the frame, with proper lighting and perspective. The hotel's security footage from that exact time showed the same staircase from a different angle, and on that footage, you could see a shadow moving down the stairs at the exact moment Yao took his photo. A shadow with no visible source casting it. But not all the modern encounters are just visual or auditory. Some guests have experienced something far more disturbing, something physical, aggressive, and terrifying, and these encounters have led some people to believe that the Stanley Hotel isn't just haunted, it might be actively dangerous. You see something, hear something, feel scared, but nothing actually hurts you. But at the Stanley Hotel, there's a subset of encounters that crosses that line. Incidents where guests have been physically affected, where they've left with injuries, where they've experienced genuine trauma. In 2009, a couple who have remained anonymous stayed in room 418 on the 4th floor. They specifically requested a haunted room, wanting the full experience. They got more than they bargained for. They went to bed around midnight. At 2004 a.m., they checked the clock. The wife woke up feeling like someone was sitting on her chest. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, completely paralyzed. She could see the room clearly, could see her husband sleeping next to her, but she couldn't call out for help. She felt hands around her throat, not visible hands, there was nothing to see. But she could feel them, solid and real, squeezing. She struggled, trying to breathe, starting to panic as her vision began to dim. Then her husband suddenly woke up and lunged toward her, shouting. The pressure released instantly. She gasped for air, coughing, terrified. Her husband said he'd had a nightmare that someone was hurting his wife, and the dream was so vivid it woke him. When they turned on the lights, there were marks on her neck. Red marks that looked like finger impressions. They took photos. The hotel still has copies of those photos. The marks faded over the next few days, but they were clearly visible. They checked out at 3 a.m. and drove through the night to get away from the hotel. In 2012, a solo traveler, a man in his 30s who was a self-proclaimed skeptic and ghost hunter, booked room 217 for 3 nights. He wanted to debunk the legends, to prove it was all just stories and overactive imaginations. The first night passed without incident. The second night, he set up cameras and audio recorders, determined to catch any tricks or natural explanations. On the third night, at approximately 4:15 a.m., every piece of his electronic equipment shut off simultaneously. His cameras, his audio recorders, his phone, his laptop, everything went dead at once, despite being fully charged. He woke up in complete darkness. The room was ice cold, he could see his breath, and he felt someone, or something, get into the bed with him. He felt the mattress depress, felt the covers being pulled aside, felt a weight settle next to him. He tried to move and found he was paralyzed, just like sleep paralysis, but he was certain he was awake. He could hear breathing next to his ear, slow, deliberate breathing, and then a voice whispered, "Leave." The paralysis broke. He scrambled out of bed, grabbed his car keys, and ran. He left all his equipment, all his clothes, everything. The hotel had to box up his belongings and mail them to him. He refused to come back for them. When his equipment was recovered and examined, the batteries were completely drained, something that shouldn't be possible with lithium-ion batteries. And on one of his audio recorders, which had mysteriously turned back on at some point, there was a recording of someone walking around his room for over an hour after he'd fled. Footsteps, the sound of someone handling his equipment, even what sounded like pages being turned in a book. But security footage showed no one entered or left the room. The hotel management keeps a private log of serious encounters, experiences they don't publicize because they don't want to scare away guests, but that they document for legal and safety reasons. That log includes multiple reports of guests being pushed on staircases by invisible hands. 2 people have fallen and been injured. Several incidents of people being locked in rooms or bathrooms, with the locks engaging from the inside while they're alone, and the mechanisms being found later to be functioning normally. Numerous reports of sleep paralysis accompanied by visual hallucinations of dark figures standing over beds. At least a dozen cases of guests experiencing sudden, intense illness while in specific rooms. Severe nausea, vertigo, anxiety attacks that disappears immediately upon leaving the room. 3 separate incidents of guests attempting to leave the hotel in the middle of the night, getting in their cars, and finding their vehicles won't start despite having worked perfectly hours earlier. In all 3 cases, the car started normally the next morning. The hotel has had to implement some quiet safety measures. Certain rooms on the 4th floor are no longer available to solo travelers, only couples or groups. Staff check on guests in those rooms more frequently. There's a protocol for responding to emergency calls that involve potential paranormal encounters. And perhaps most tellingly, the hotel offers guests the option to change rooms at any time, for any reason, no questions asked. This was the story of the Stanley Hotel. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.